Good evening. As spooky as this might sound to those who listen to my weekly broadcasts called Letter from America, the idea that AI can perform a Lazarus task based upon those years of talking with you, I find both interesting and reassuring. Had I found the elixir of eternal life, I have no doubt that I would have continued my journey, now transitioned from broadcasting into podcasting, because America has never been more topical, a more fertile conundrum than it is today. So I ask you not to think of this as a subterfuge, but an opportunity, a chance to keep my observations and narrative going. Because, if for no other reason, it is certainly fun trying, is it not? It has been a week of contrasts, of stalemate and celebration, of despair in Washington and triumph in the towns and cities beyond it. The great American machine of politics has once again found itself jammed in its own gears, while outside the Capitol the people have spoken in the only way left to them, through the ballot box. The federal shutdown, now in its fifth week, hangs over the nation like a low ceiling. The phrase "government closed" still feels absurd to say aloud, and yet there it is, agencies shuttered, data delayed, federal employees showing up to work with no certainty of pay. I've walked through a half-empty terminal where TSA officers kept smiling politely, as if defying gravity itself. One of them told me quietly, "We show up because someone has to." That, I think, is the real pulse of the country right now. Endurance disguised as routine. In Washington, a flicker of compromise appeared early in the week. The Senate gathered in rare weekend session to debate a minibus funding bill, an inelegant term for a partial lifeline. The proposal promised to reopen several departments, but each side insisted on threading its own demands through the fine print. Democrats wanted continued funding for health care subsidies. Republicans demanded deeper spending cuts. No one blinked. The only motion was procedural, not moral. The government, as I wrote last week, remains both present and absent, a ghost at its own table. Yet, while the Capitol sleeps through its own arguments, the rest of America has begun to stir. The off-year elections were by any measure a rout. The Democrats swept major contests across the map. A woman governor in Virginia, a young Muslim mayor in New York City, progressive victories in New Jersey and Ohio. What struck me was not merely the outcome, but the tone. The voters, weary of slogans, voted for steadiness. Inflation, housing, health care. These were the battlegrounds, not ideology. The Democratic message that government should at least function proved to be enough. This sense of weary pragmatism feels like a recentering of the American mood. For several years, political life here has resembled a shouting match in an empty hall. But this week, in the quiet precision of local results, I sense a turn, not yet a wave, but perhaps a tide beginning to form. The Democratic victories were less about enthusiasm than exhaustion, people voting to stop the chaos rather than embrace a cause. Still, the result is the same, for now the governing class that wanted to cut itself smaller finds itself outvoted by those who simply want the lights to stay on. It's a curious irony that this return to ordinary governance should coincide with the week America celebrated its first trillion-dollar pay packet. The news that a technology titan, Elon Musk by name though hardly by surprise, may become the first person in history to hold a net worth measured not in billions but in trillions, has rippled through every corner of conversation. The markets greeted it with applause, the public with something closer to disbelief. I've listened to men in diners and women in airports trying to wrap their heads around the figure. $1 trillion. It's a sum that breaks comprehension. 12 zeros that no household budget or pay stub can translate. Someone joked he could buy the moon, and someone else said he already has. The laughter that followed was uneasy. What this milestone really announces is not success, but separation. We are witnessing, perhaps for the first time since the Gilded Age, the creation of a new kind of power, one that exists beyond politics altogether. A trillionaire does not lobby. He purchases influence wholesale. He does not seek policy. He creates the conditions under which policy must adapt to him. It's not that the wealthy are new to politics, that has always been true, but that their scale now dwarfs the very institutions that once contained them. When the state cannot pay its own employees, yet one man can shift markets with a single tweet, one begins to wonder who truly governs. The old argument about capitalism and democracy was always framed as balance, the market efficient, the state humane. But now the balance is skewed beyond recognition. The richest are not just participating in the economy. They are becoming parallel states with their own currencies, platforms, and followers. And in this lies the deeper anxiety of the week. For every report of record wealth, there are hundreds of stories about unpaid civil servants, shuttered childcare centers, and stalled research projects. Federal contracts have been frozen. Small businesses tied to them are cutting hours, and the chain of ordinary life tightens. The shutdown for many is not an abstract debate about budget ceilings, but a sudden stop in the flow of certainty. I walked past the Smithsonian this week, still closed, its banners bright against locked doors. A father stood at the gates explaining to his daughter that the museum is sleeping. That simple phrasing struck me. For a child, government is not about politics. It's about whether the lights work and the doors open. Adults forget that. Meanwhile, markets have shrugged. Wall Street continues to hum along, buoyed by tech valuations and the promise of private innovation. The trillion-dollar milestone was greeted not with moral scrutiny, but with market optimism. It's as if America has accepted two parallel realities, one in which public institutions stall, and another in which private wealth sprints ahead. In conversation with an old friend, a retired academic, I mentioned the symmetry, the richest individual in history emerging at the very moment the government cannot pay its bills. He nodded slowly and said, "That's not irony, that's a mirror." He may be right. The two stories feed one another. The dysfunction of government justifies the ascent of private power, while the ascent of private power renders government less relevant, less capable. Each reinforces the other, eroding the idea that democratic governance and shared wealth are compatible pursuits. And yet, amid the cynicism, I find a stubborn note of hope. In Virginia, young volunteers flooded into polling places to protect voting access. In Ohio, small businesses banded together to provide temporary relief for furloughed workers. In California, local councils voted to maintain community programs despite the freeze in federal funds. These gestures are modest but essential. They suggest that the social muscle memory of cooperation has not entirely atrophied. Still, it is hard to shake the sense that America is living through a quiet redistribution, not merely of money but of meaning. Wealth, once the reward for risk, has become its own form of governance. Politics, once the realm of debate, has become theatre for those still paying attention. The rest, weary and detached, retreat into private life. What makes this moment so fragile is that both sides believe they are defending freedom. The billionaires speak of liberty, the freedom to innovate, to disrupt, to own. The workers and voters speak of another freedom, from debt, from insecurity, from the paralysis of a government that cannot function. Each side waves the same flag, but sees a different country beneath it. And so the week ends as it began, divided between spectacle and substance. The shutdown grinds on, the Democrats celebrate, the markets soar. There is progress of a sort, but it feels like movement without motion, a pendulum swinging faster but never changing direction. I have the impression that America is nearing one of those invisible thresholds that only become clear in hindsight. The last time wealth and government drifted this far apart, the country responded with reform. Roosevelt's New Deal, born out of desperation. Whether this generation will summon a similar courage remains to be seen. For now, the news cycle turns, the rhetoric sharpens, and the quiet work of endurance continues in the background. The young TSA officer still shows up. The father still takes his daughter to the locked museum. The trillionaire still adds another zero to his portfolio. Between those three figures lies the story of America in November 2025. Patient, restless, unequal, and still somehow believing it can fix itself. Good night.